Welcome to my talk. This will be more or less a reflection of what we did last year in the Google Summer of Code and a small demo of where we are and what we plan to have. Google Summer of Code, I would say Samba edition is a bit different to normal Google Summer of Code in a sense that the Google typically sponsors a subset of projects that apply to the Summer of Code. There are many projects applying and many students applying over years. Since 2005, I think there are like thousands projects now try to apply and tens of thousands students to apply to the project. So resources are constrained. And last year, we basically got only one project to choose to work on because, well, that was our allocated seat for the thing. We got 4 projects, 4 proposals from different students. And one of these was the written desectors for MS-PAR protocol for the asynchronous remote printing stuff. And there was already a student working on this actually just before even proposing it. Then the other one was the Cockpit UI prototype project that I will be talking about, which was based on a prototype that I created like 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago, trying to see how we can get through this. And I reported about this at sambaXP in 2018. And then we had 2 proposals which weren't of great quality, and we decided not to go with them. But since the actual we had only one seat allocated to work on it, we choose to go with the Cockpit UI proposal because there is also a requirement for this effort to from the mentor side. So we had to have at least 2 mentors available from the Samba team to handle it, and there wasn't really a second mentor for the Wireshark proposal, so we decided to keep with 1 seat and go with the Cockpit UI proposal. And what is Cockpit? The Cockpit is actually a web-based console to manage Linux systems. It's you can call it a graphical interface for servers. You effectively log in through the browser and then have access to all the tools you have in Shell, but you can discover them with a bit of graphical help. So what we had is a student called Hezekiah Mina applying to the project. The Hezekiah actually comes from Kenya, University of Nairobi, and he was actually studying real estate, hopefully graduating with bachelor degree this year. I'm not sure whether he graduated already or will be graduating relatively soon, like in a month or 2. And Hezekiah was already experienced with the JavaScript and React, and the Cockpit is web thing, so most of it is actually written in JavaScript internally and using some portions of a React system. But he had been new to Linux and new to Samba. So this is interesting thing that we get a student who is willing to learn as a part of this project, and this aligns very well with the Google Summer of Code goals, because aside from participating in open source development, we it really also need to bring some good things to the student as well. like exploring new areas, learning how to work with the teams and doing that remotely. And obviously, Google Summer of Code gives some monetary rewards for doing this work. And the nice term they have for this, flip bits, not burgers, still allows to kind of combine things together. And one thing I witnessed is in the past years, I've been Google Summer of Code mentor in like 2007, I think. Is that students, they learn a lot of stuff and they experiment a lot, but they don't really have exposure to real world development processes at the time when they are in university. So open source development and research of unknown topics is a perfect place where you could research that, not to the same way as recently was seen on the Linux kernel, abuse of that kind of collaboration. But in the Google Summer of Code, where you have curated communication between the student and mentors and the open source project community, it becomes easier to drive through workflows that are not really well described, let's say this way, and well known to the students. So there's something new to learn, not only on the technical level, but also on a project flow and so on. So for actual Samba Google Summer of Code goals, we had to, we defined like how we can see how the Samba world and the, say, contemporary web world, how they can be combined together, how they live together in this area. We wanted to give an ability to learn how open source communities work, how contribution process works, what it means to also for us to see what we produce by a person with a fresh eye on it. Obviously, we wanted to get the improvement over the previous prototype, but it wasn't necessarily to just take that prototype and start with that code. Maybe the rewrite would be easy and so on. And the other part of it was how to share this work, how to get the continuously see the progress and how to deliver it. And these were kind of goals that Hezekiah started working on. And let me step a bit back to the previous talk I had on this topic of the Cockpit UI. So 3 years ago at the sambaXP, I was talking about the need to have an easier way to manage Samba. And if we look into this, is a slide from that time, the numbers changed. They only grew up. They didn't really reduce. But if we look at the Samba, it has a huge number of options. At the file share configurations, there are more than 100, maybe 140, 150 now different options per each share if we just look at the file server operations, but also in the server roles that we have, there are like a lot of different things and more than 300 and a half options available to configure Samba. So it's almost impossible to keep up with all these things, and especially if you don't have good practices documented and define it somewhere, it's almost impossible for a person who just comes to Samba to install, let's say, Active Directory domain controller to choose the right combination. So the idea was to make a tool that allows to experiment easier with a safer choice of configurations, and at the same time gradually allowed to learn how Samba managed it internally. We still didn't achieve all of that, and typically we talk about like Samba configuration as what you have on smb.conf, but that's in reality not really what it is. There's a lot of other things that needs to be configured altogether. And there are many utilities. They have inconsistency in the interfaces, inconsistency in options, and so on. So Andreas will be talking about that later today. And so all of this really wants to have some sort of a better front door to be more attractive. So if we come back, then the cockpit itself has the couple concepts that are fairly important. So one of the most important concepts is that really what you see in a cockpit, it can be done in just a normal shell. It's not something that cockpit wraps around and hides the complexity by creating some magic sauce that you cannot reproduce in a shell. No, it simply runs the set of commands that you would run yourself. And ideally, if we do this set of commands, and it's more complex than the obvious one, maybe we should have some playbooks that describe these steps and so on. But the idea is that you shouldn't put any logic that encapsulates what's run in the shell into the UI. You just run the commands and rely on the output. Then you present information that already exists in the system. Yes, you can make it nicer looking and so on, but it's already there and can be retrieved by the other means as well if that is needed. So there shouldn't be anything in the cockpit UI that kind of makes you a prisoner to the UI. And finally, this means that it's really a tool to discover what's under the cockpit. It's under the on it. Don't add additional layers of it. Allow people to see how things work, but at the same time, allow them to quickly achieve what they want. It's a laudable set of goals and concepts, much harder to achieve in reality, but if we look into how we try to get this, at least for Samba Active Directory setup, we have one primary tool, and we try to concentrate things around management of Samba AD within this tool. Not everything is there, not everything is kind of optimal, but still we aim to use this tool. So we still need some manual steps to do the deployment, but the rest, like management of it, can theoretically be done with the Samba tool. So the premise that we had was, actually, let's do something around Samba tool. And this is how the cockpit Samba AD UI looks like, with a bit of transformation of the code that Hezekiah did during the actual summer of code last year to just fit into the current cockpit in Fedora. So let me try to show you. Please tell me if you see the browser view. Sadly, I don't see a chat anywhere. So if
we can see it.
Can see it.
Okay, great. So this is the browser that looks into a VM that I have with Cockpit enabled on it. So if I log in it as root, in this case, that's enough for us. I'll get the actual console for Cockpit that shows certain information, and some of it is updated dynamically, like the memory and CPU and stuff. We can see that there is some network happening, there is traffic going. Basically, we communicate with it, and you can look into the details of the interfaces and so on. You can look at the services that are running on the machine through systemd services. You can see that I have Samba AD running and configure it on the system. And you can look into the logs from the journal and so on. Then all the additional services that are not the core Cockpit setup, they can be installed as so-called applications. So what was created as a part of the Google Summer of Code is a prototype of the Samba AD DC management application, and it's available here in the tools. So if I log in, I go to this tooling, and I can see certain things, like I can see computers. There is only one domain controller on the list. This is really a prototype, so it doesn't have the fancy things around, but it can show you some stuff like users or groups, and it can filter things out in the UI and so on. So it shows that you could do certain things, and you can actually request some data and see the results and so on. So this is about it. There are some things that you can create information and add users and so on. But really what we investigated is how to get through all of this, how to communicate with Samba tool, and how to represent the data. So there are some other settings, like if you're on non-joined machine, you could try to join existing domain and maybe apply certain role and so on. But these are not fully complete yet. There's a bunch of things that needs to be done. And this is basically running on the Fedora development branch on Rawhide from, I think, yesterday. The prototype is based on the code that Hezekiah developed last year. And I've actually successfully deployed Samba AD domain controller with it and can show the state and so on. What happens behind the scenes is that we actually run samba-tool commands. So for example, for listening the domain information, we can actually do Samba tool domain. I think it's what list. No, info. Yes, info. And you get the same information we see in this list, and that's really how it works, by issuing these commands and performing them. It doesn't describe them. That would be educational part of it. We didn't do that. Parsing the output is one thing that we might want to have a better way, because right now it's a human output from Samba tool. There is no machine parsable output. So you have to do some parsing, and that might fail at some point. But the application itself is written in JavaScript, and it uses the Cockpit libraries and Cockpit APIs to integrate. So, for example, this the list that we see here, this table, is part of Cockpit uniform interface, and the buttons are also styled the same way as they're styled in the other Cockpit views, and also the actual communication to run the shell is happening over the Cockpit interfaces, which means that it looks like a SSH session, and it's not really SSH because it runs over the web-based protocol, but it authenticates correctly. It could use locally sudo if required. You don't need to be root. It can run against the different servers. So from one machine, you can manage multiple machines in the same UI. And it opens a lot of nice possibilities. So the whole result of the Google Summer of Code is described on the our wiki. And let me go to some challenges that we had. So one thing was that we don't only wanted to have this kind of UI that is responsive and nice and working. We also wanted to set up the tooling to obtain the results while development is ongoing. So we set up the project on GitLab and used OpenSUSE, the build system, to create automated builds for different distributions. This proved to be challenging, but I was impressed by Hezekiah persistence, and I think it took him a couple of weeks to actually figure it all out and do the builds. The one thing that was a bit weird, and it's one of the examples of how the problematic this new web world is, that if you do JavaScript and React-based things, you need to use the Node.js and the other environments, and they often want to download all the stuff from internet, and you don't have internet access in the build systems in the typical Linux distribution environment. So you cannot really download, you have to have stuff in advance. The Cockpit project itself recognized this, and they developed, after we completed the Google Summer of Code, they developed a number of helpers to be run in the GitLab or GitHub in their case, to basically produce the tarballs with the predefined source code. Then you can just package that source code and create normal packages without internet access. The other problem that Hezekiah discovered is that our documentation, while being quite large and extensive, it doesn't really look towards or being friendly towards the people who never installed Samba AD. So it assumes a lot of knowledge, pre-existing knowledge. And that is something that I think we could address with the Cockpit-based UI, because it would allow us to well, I'm kind of conflicting with myself saying that allowed to hide, but maybe allowed to guide the people who don't know where to look at with the interactive helps and interactive description of the certain details that need to be there. And because we can construct properly working command line interfaces, the UI itself, not just for management, it could be turned for educational purposes by displaying these commands after they constructed and so on. So it has a possibilities to look into other than not just for the normal administrative work, but also for educating administrators. The other part I already told about is the Samba tool parsing. I was looking into adding the machine parsable output to Samba tool but a few years ago, but didn't complete that. It would require a certain level of refactoring of our Samba tool Python code to achieve this. But it's definitely is needed if we want to add more automation around Samba. And finally, one of the bigger issues is, as always, it's developing against a moving target. So, for example, if you create an interface and you call certain Samba tool command, and later this command gets refactored and renamed into a different command name in Samba, it will stop working. So some mechanism to synchronize these changes to validate the commands and input and output would be really great. Again, Andreas is talking about some of this for other utilities in Samba, but I think it will be useful to apply here as well. The thing that often is not seen clearly with the Google Summer of Code is that it's not really necessary for open source projects to actually productize the work done as a part of the Summer of Code project. But how we would productize this? We don't expect that the student would develop a production-ready code, because that's not the actual purpose of it. But if the code is good enough, we can start extending it. And here we have a problem that most of us are not really web developers. We tried in 2004, 2008, we had an interface called SWAT, Samba Web Administration Tool, and that even had its own share of CVEs associated with the implementation, so that tells a lot about our quality. Samba actually had embedded JavaScript engine at some point to aid with the development of SWOT replacement, and then was removed from the Samba code. So it's hard to get the things working between the two walls, and this is what we try to investigate. So one thing we found out, and I think this is something that could be useful as a lesson from this Summer of Code work, is that once you have a Cockpit plugin structure, like a template, or in this case, a prototype, it's relatively easy to add new things. And the code mostly stays the same. You don't need to change much of it if it's designed properly. If you want to extend and do some operations, like what commands you call out, or what Samba tool utilities commands you call, or some other tools, or copy files, these can be moved to individual scripts that would be installed on the system and used there. And these individual scripts can also be used for general administration with the tools like Ansible. So reading these as playbooks and then running the playbooks instead of directly running Samba Tools so is another possibility. And that would help also to start doing things in the cockpit and then produce a playbook that you can run against your systems in fully automated way. So that's one possibility. Finally, I would like to remind that, yeah, we use Samba a lot by people, but we also consume the outputs from Samba and results from logs and other tools by different automation systems, and we have some space to improve on this area. And we should do better there with the maybe a little magic for people in the visual representation of the data and little help with the machine parsable output for the robots. So that's all I have. Thank you. Let me stop sharing this, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
Hey, Alexander, it's Jeremy here.
Hi, Jeremy.
So JSON, we already
Yes.
have that. That's probably the best output format, yeah?
Yeah, we have JSON support in certain places, but not everywhere. So for example, in Samba tool, we do not have machine parsable output in general. We only have some JSON output in the DRS tools like DRS dump and so on, but not in the, let's say, like I show with the Samba tool domain info or Samba tool user list and so on. So these are not machine parsable. You have to apply certain logic there. And yes, I agree that it should be a JSON output. It just that when I tried to add this support myself, I realized that let's say our way of structuring output in the Samba tool Python code, it needs a lot of improvement.
Thanks, Alexander. Yeah. What might help actually is if you log a bug basically with the list of commands that would really help to have JSON output. At least then we have everything in one place that we know we can go in and add JSON output, you know, piecemeal one at a time and sort of, you know, and slowly close it.
We at the same time we need to develop some sort of structured representation of what we want to output. JSON is a container, but it's not so like it's not a panacea again here to output in the same container if you don't have a predefined format of what to expect there. Okay. Other questions?
Have you thought about just changing some of the base classes we use for the logging so that at least the informational status things that are coming, like that would be a fairly easy place to start with the JSON bit, was so that those classes at least output, instead of it being, you know, fancy long date in color, colon information, you know, that's at least, you know, just the severity that it got from the caller, and you know, and the message just as a separate line. I mean, that would at least start you down that road, and would, you know, you get a lot of wins fairly fast.
That's
Because,
exactly what I
existing
did
classes.
in 2018. I started looking into how I can refactor that and produce. I'm probably should have somewhere a branch with the original experiment for adding the JSON output. What I found quickly is that there are plenty of calls that do this output, that do formatting right in place. So what they call into the log is a pre-formatted string with the message and the values intermixed already there. So it needs more fundamental rethinking how we do this structured logging. But yes, absolutely, it's possible to do that. I gave up at my prototype experiment simply because I realized that it's not easy to achieve that in the time box that I made for myself.
Yeah. As is so much the case with so much in Samba development.
Yeah. So in the chat, I see a question that does it work only if the cockpit installed on the Samba DC? Yes. So you effectively need to have the tool or plugin installed on the machine where you want to produce it. However, if we do some integration with, let's say, playbooks, Ansible-like playbooks, there's no problem in designating one machine for management and then applying the results to a different machine. So kind of provision a separate machine for it. In Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Cockpit is actually a tool that's enabled by default. And there was even an attempt to do like Cockpit is the only thing that is enabled. So you log in over this web port that Cockpit provides, and then do everything else. And when I talk about Ansible, I'm just wishful thinking here. It's not that Cockpit requires Ansible or something, answering to Igor's question on the chat. No, Cockpit doesn't use Ansible for anything other than its own test environment. It's just that I'm trying to think about how we can reuse the results of a management console administration towards the automation of administration based on what you did in the console. The other question from Thomas, am I right to think this Cockpit plugin could largely replace the Microsoft RSAT tools when administrating Samba AD? I would say that would be one of possible goals if we implement all the management tools that supported by Samba Tools, like provide interfaces to all the Samba tool stuff. Then I don't see a problem to have this actually to be the open RSAT over Samba AD. What is needed desperately is the help with the web application development. We need people who know beyond Samba, know the JavaScript and the other things. We can help with the internals on Samba, but we, at least I am not the web developer, and most of us are not in Samba team. So it's a good opportunity to work on Samba if you don't even know what Samba is, but you know how to work with contemporary web. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you for listening. As I said, the material is available on the Samba wiki, and I will provide the slides, or they also have links, and I will have also the updated build in my copy wrapper for Fedora to try the new stuff. But it's really more a prototype at this point than the fundamentally productized thing. And thank you to Hezekiah, and actually thank you to Andrew to do the Google Summer of Code mentoring last year.
Yeah. So one last question on that. How are you feeling about Google Summer of Code with the new shorter Summer of Code for this year? We didn't really get any applications and things this time round. What's your feeling on that?
Frankly, I think it will be much harder with the level of information you would need to know about Samba, or protocols around it. It will be much harder to have Google Summer of Code with a half of time than it was last year. Last year, I think we had just exact amount of time to get the productive output of that project. Well, with half of that time, I suspect, and people not really familiar with Samba, I suspect it will be quite struggling project.
And have you learned anything about how we should be bringing new contributors on board? Because you've seen all the things I've done over too many years trying to make this new contributor thing easier, and I still worry we're not winning. Did you have any other insights in bringing up what clearly a very brand new contributor to Samba about things that we're just still not getting right about being able to contribute to Samba itself?
I think there are a few factors here. What we could improve is good API documentation for various parts of Samba. Good introductory documentation to how Samba is structured and what could be used and how it could be used and so on. I think we could take a lead from web-based projects, open source project that develop some sort of applications and so on. They are often providing a very nice overview, very nice documentation generated from something in their code that helps to navigate. I think that this navigation inside the code is something that we desperately need, also for not for newcomers, but also for seasoned people.